Welcome, everybody. We're getting arranged here. We'll let a few more folks come in if they need to, and we'll get started in a second. As Meg is pointing out in the chat there, if you wouldn't mind just going ahead and dropping into the chat, say hi to everybody and let us know where you're calling in from, if you would, please. All right, well, it looks like we're at our time to start. I want to welcome everybody. My name is Dan Yaeger. I'm the Executive Director of NEMA, and welcome to New England Museums Week. It's very apt that our very first day of New England Museums Week is from the great state of Maine. Everybody in Maine seems to be wonderful advocates for their institutions and for the museum field and culture generally. And we've always had a huge turnout at our Maine Museums Day in person, which I'm absolutely looking forward to in person again at some point, and seeing you all in 3D and not in 2D, as we've gotten used to, our old friends. But anyway, this is, I think, the last couple of years, though, of the pandemic and being connected with each other in 2 dimensions via Zoom and so forth has really magnified the importance of advocacy and our ability to stay connected as folks, as we're in our different places. But I'm seeing how important advocacy has been and how effective it's been, because it really has helped us, I think, weather these storms over the last couple of years on a number of different fronts, both federally and on a state level and locally and so forth. So good for y'all for being here today to join together and speaking up for museums and our cultural attractions. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our good friends from the Maine Archives and Museums. And Dugan, you do a great job maintaining your connections with everybody here. And I'll turn it over to you, and then you'll get it over to Meg, and we'll get the day started. Dugan?
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dan. My name is Dugan Murphy. I'm the Executive Director of the Association of Maine Archives and Museums, or MAM, as we like to call it. Thanks for everybody for joining us today. I'm excited about our guest speakers. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement, an acknowledgement of the land at least I'm standing on, and I think most of you are standing or sitting within what we now call the state of Maine. Historically, we're talking about Wabanaki. This is the home of the Wabanaki people, has been for thousands of years. Wabanaki is the Algonquin name for this place. It's part of a larger land area that historically has been the land of the indigenous people of this part of the world, and was never ceded to the state of Maine or the United States, to the French, to the English colonizers, or any of their descendant institutions. And I want to really admire the ability of the Wabanaki to, through the years, maintain their sovereignty, skillfully navigate diplomatic relations with both the state of Maine and the United States to this day. And we have 5 sovereign indigenous nations who all live in what we now call the state of Maine and are part of this Wabanaki Confederacy, which has endured to this day and is well 100 years older than the United States. We're talking about the Abenaki, the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, Micmac, and Maliseet. And the last thing I want to say on this point is that we fully support these nations' current claims to land and water rights, as well as historic artifacts of Wabanaki origin. And we'd like to collectively commit today to decolonizing the stories we share so that we can more accurately represent the people whose land we're standing on. Specifically today, we're talking about museums. And oftentimes we're dealing with things from the past. We're also dealing with artwork, living collections and stuff. Maine has more museums per capita than any state of the union. This is one thing that makes us very unique. And we're not just talking about what makes museums special. We're talking about advocating for museums, which can be a really scary thing because we're talking about oftentimes talking to people who make decisions about government funding or policy changes and stuff like that. But it's really important to know that 95% of voters approve of public policy that supports museums. 95% is pretty darn good. There's nothing else really you can find that gets 95% approval rating. So you're not talking about a controversial thing when you're talking to lawmakers about museums and supporting them. You're also talking about something that is a major boost to the economy. We're talking about a state, our state of Maine, which relies very heavily on tourism. 76% of the people generally who are going to be coming to Maine are coming here visiting heritage sites and museums, the very places that we're running. They're going to spend about 60% more than the people who are coming here for other reasons. They're generally staying here longer, which is why we can claim a 1-to-1 ratio in the jobs economy. For every one job that we have at a museum, there's a whole nother job being created somewhere else at a grocery store or something like that, because of the impact, the undeniable impact that museums have on the economy. And for every $1 of federal or state funding, any kind of government funding that's spent on a museum funding these organizations, we're going to get about a $5 return into the economy that way. Sounds pretty good, 5-to-1. It's an easy conversation, I think, to have for all of these reasons. I just want to get that out there first and have that in mind. Easy conversations when you have these numbers in mind. And then I want to pass it on to Meg from NEMA.
Thanks, Dugan. All right, morning, everybody. I don't know how many of you have had a chance to have a look at any of the advocacy camp presentations that we did last month with some background on good advocacy tips and good advocacy practices. So since I wanted to make sure that everybody started today feeling at least somewhat comfortable with the plan for the week, we're going to do a quick run through of some do's and don'ts for advocacy and some quick reminders before I turn it over to your local state experts. So why this year? What makes it an important time to be talking about advocacy? And, every year there are budget questions. Every year there are tax policy questions. Every year somebody is talking about something to do with education policy. All of those are things that impact museums. So those are always worth thinking about and paying attention to. But this year we have continuing distribution of COVID relief packages at the state level where the money from the federal government is still coming through. There are local revitalization initiatives. There was a big editorial in the Globe last week about in Boston, why don't arts and cultural organizations have a seat at the table for the plans for revitalizing downtown Boston post-COVID, et cetera. There are the midterm federal elections coming up, so it's really important to be thinking about whether you want to be getting involved in any kind of voter registration or voter education efforts, which nonprofits are totally allowed to do, and I'll get back to that in a minute. There are also, in many of the states, legislative and gubernatorial elections happening in the region this year. So there are a lot of reasons to be paying attention, even if it's not like a big presidential election year. Advocacy matters all the time, and it is a slow, repetitive, relationship building kind of process. So even if none of these things were happening, it would still be worth chatting about those eternal three to start with. But still, this is a year where it's worth paying attention and being heard. Advocacy, as a reminder, can sound a little intimidating, but it's already on the sliding scale of the things you do. So public relations and education, you're all already good at letting people know you exist and what you're up to, telling them something about your mission. Advocacy is just the next step where you're saying, this is where our mission intersects with and is impacted by public policy and civic engagement. So the final step in that is lobbying, where it moves beyond education to saying, and because you now know all of these things, we would like you to do X about it. Now, lobbying is the word that really scares a lot of people, but as a reminder, you are allowed to ask people to do that kind of thing, particularly when you're voting for a cause. As a nonprofit, you cannot tell people to vote for a person, but you can talk to people about causes and supporting specific bills until you're blue in the face. So you can, in fact, do that as long as it's less than 10% of your paid job. The rules vary slightly from state to state, but that's like the rough rule. If it's less than 10% of your time that you're talking to your legislators, you don't have to worry about registering to be a lobbyist or anything else. So, reminder of rules for who can advocate. Nonprofits can inform people, but not instruct them. So you can say, here's what's happening with climate change in Maine. And this is why we think this is important, because this is how it impacts our institution and our visitors. You cannot then say, and therefore in this local race that's happening, we want you to vote for X person because Y person doesn't believe in climate change. But you can just say, we think this is important and we hope you'll take this into account when you go to vote. You can also do things like send out questionnaires to, say, all of the candidates that are participating in a local race, and then publish what their answers are. You just cannot selectively edit them to make them look better or worse. You cannot choose to only publish some of them. You have to be completely nonpartisan. So any opportunities you're offering to one candidate, you have to offer to everybody, including being a host for an event or anything else. And you can ask for support. You can ask your members to get in touch with their local legislators to support XYZ. You can ask your trustees to get in touch with their local legislators. You can reach out to your local legislators and say, this is important and we would like you to support X. You just can only ever talk about issues, not people. As an individual, if you're concerned about representing yourself instead of your organization, then you want to make sure that you're reaching out from your own email account or social media account. Do it on your own time, lunch, some other kind of break. If you're on flex time, then you can still do it within traditional work hours, just not when you're technically working. And if there are multiples of you representing your organization, make sure that you're talking to your colleagues so that you're all saying the same thing, because you don't want to be sending mixed messages. Just as a reminder, virtual contact is still contact. So people are still reaching out to their public officials, even though fortunately now most offices are now open again, but still a lot of people are doing mostly virtual contact. So social media, virtual town halls and listening sessions, newsletters and mailing lists, email, phone, virtual meetings. Those are all perfectly legitimate ways to be reaching out to your state representatives or your town council or anything else. As a reminder, if you're doing social media, make sure that you tag them with their handle to get their attention, especially if you're reaching out to a specific office. Use some relevant hashtags, not like an entire giant stripe of blue, because that makes people's eyes cross over and they just don't pay attention anymore. But if there is an event tag, like ours is hashtag New England Museum Week or hashtag Maine Museums, please include those, because it helps those of us who are the organizers track what kind of engagement we're getting. And if there are other ones, like for instance, something that's a hashtag specific to your town or something like that, you can use that as well to help people in your area find what you're talking about. Signing up for your legislators' email lists, following them on social media, those are all really great too, to get an idea of what is important to them for when you're talking to them later. You already know how to do advocacy style language, because it's a lot like writing an exhibit label. You want to pick your strongest, most interesting facts and get it out there in as punchy and short and interesting a way as possible. So you heard Dugan talking about, 95% of people supporting legislators who support museums, that kind of thing. Those are really good and useful statistics to have at your fingertips, and they stick in the memory. Ta-da. And the power of your story is not only in providing the context and those kinds of statistics like Dugan was mentioning, but the story needs your details. What is specific and personal to your site, to your experience as a museum worker? Make sure it's informative, make sure that it's timely. If you're telling a story about how life was in working in museums 15 years ago, that may or may not really feel very relevant to the legislator who wants to know what's going on with museum workers now. You do not need to start from scratch. There are a lot of good templates and examples out there. MAM has a great economic impact statement, for instance, and I'm sure Dugan or Greta can drop a link to that in the chat for you. We also here at NEMA have a bunch of templates, including a template called Work Your Words, figuring out how to basically take your like 3 main points and tell a short, punchy story, kind of like building an elevator speech. We also have one for developing your own different kinds of impact statements. And again, I did an entire session on doing this at Advocacy Camp, and you can find the recording on our website if you want to learn more about impact statements for moving on from here. And you are never alone when you're advocating. There are a lot of resources out there to help you and a lot of organizations who are here to help. We at NEMA, folks at AAM, Americans for the Arts, ASLH, the History Relevance Organization, your state cultural organizations and nonprofit networks. MAM, of course, is here to help. And we've been dropping a bunch of good resources from our resource library, et cetera, into the Museums Advocacy and New Museum Week hashtag. So even if you just scroll back the last few days, you'll see some of the stuff that we've been posting that can help you with your advocacy. Most important things to remember when you're doing any kind of advocacy, but on social media, it's especially important. Text can come off a little strange because there's no vocal inflection to go with it. So make sure that you are thinking about your attitude and how it reads in what you're writing. Your audience, are you talking to your members? Are you talking to general visitors? Are you talking to local politicians, et cetera? And your asks. So are you asking them to make any particular kind of, share your story here, or please vote for X, or please contact your legislator to say why this is important. Make sure that that is part of what you're talking about. If you are going the next step and you're, say, writing a letter to your legislator or putting in a call to their office or something like that, you do want to think about doing a little research. Have a look at their committee assignments. Where are they on the political spectrum? What kinds of bills have they sponsored or signed on to? What are their policy interests? Because that will help you really figure out how to frame whatever your approach is. Like, hey, we happen to know, Dan, can I use your favorite example? We happen to know the representative is really into trains, and would you write a letter of support for the train museum to get a grant for XYZ, et cetera. That always helps if you can appeal to something they already care about. Also, what matters to you brings the energy into the room. So make sure that you think about why are you here? What's important to you? And use that when you're in your communications. Finally, if you do actually reach out to your offices and make contact, follow up with them later. It's really important. Politics is a long game. Advocacy is a long game. Relationship building is the most important thing. Answer any questions they have or get back to them if they ask a question you can't answer. Share any resources you have. Invite them to visit or to speak at an upcoming event, whether it's a virtual event or an in-person one. Keep in touch and thank them for being approachable and for whatever support they offer to you. You can do it on your social media, in your member newsletters. You can send them a private thank you note. Thanks go a long way. All right. Now 100% of you, my new favorite statistic, are ready to be passionate, competent, and compelling museum advocates. So I will pause here for a second and stop sharing my screen so that I can see people again. Does anybody have any questions about any of that before I turn it over to our friend David? If you could raise your hand or type the question in the chat, let me know. And thank you to those of you who've been dropping helpful links in the chat too. Appreciate it. Oh, all right. If anybody comes up with questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and I will answer them there. But for right now, I am going to pass the baton over to David Greenham. Thank you so much for being here today, David.
Sure thing. Good morning, my friends. I'm David Greenham. I'm the Executive Director of the Maine Arts Commission. I just actually celebrated my first anniversary in that position last week. So I'm still standing, so that's good. But thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks to Dan and Meg and Heather for all the work you're doing for New England Museums, and of course Dugan and Greta here in Maine. You might be wondering why is the director of the Maine Arts Commission speaking here about advocacy for museums. I actually came to the Maine Arts Commission from the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine, where I was the assistant director. But prior to that, all of my experiences in the arts, I ran the theater at Monmouth for many, many years. But also even there in Monmouth, if you're familiar with the beautiful Cumston Hall, which is a museum and a beautiful artifact of our state, I was very much involved in the restoration and expansion of that historic building. And I know we all have shared needs and responsibilities with regard to how do we keep our organizations moving forward, and that of course is a universal concern for all cultural organizations. And so I just wanted to start with a quick overview of what we at the Maine Arts Commission have done with regard to recovery funding, our ARPA funding, the American Recovery Program Act. We received $750,000 or so to support arts organizations in the state for recovery. We spent about $200,000 of that last spring, and then had what we called the Arts Jobs Grant opportunity, which was for organizations and individuals. And we thought we'd get about 100 applications. We had $500,000 to give. We thought we would be able to support about, 50% of the applicants. We ended up receiving 253 applications with a total ask of $3.1 million. And so our $500,000 wasn't going to go very far. And so we started to think about what kind of advocacy can we engage in to help those folks who are not clearly going to get funding from our money, but is there any money that we can find? And we learned that counties, our county governments, all received pretty large amounts of ARPA funding. And so we approached our counties. We broke the applications up by county, and we approached the counties, and then we encouraged our applicants to approach their counties, and we asked them to do some advocacy, not just for their own organization, but for all of the other organizations in their county who had not received this funding either. So the concept, of course, is that, a high tide lifts all boats. We have an opportunity with a high tide of this ARPA funding that's come to the state in many different ways. And the counties have a lot of funding, and they're slowly figuring out what to do with it. The challenge, of course, is that the counties aren't used to giving away money. and so they're having to figure it out. Most of them, it seems, have gone to the communities and said, in their county, and said, what do you need? And some are taking applications. But if you have not looked into what your community is planning to do with ARPA funding and what your county government is planning to do with ARPA funding, I'd really encourage you to do that. And then I want to tell you, it probably won't work. And that's probably the most important lesson of advocacy, is that just because you ask once, just because you make contact once, doesn't mean you're going to be successful. In my view, you probably need to plan to contact somebody or touch somebody in a decision-making position at least 10 times before you make an ask, because that way you know them. And Dugan's example of the legislator who likes trains is exactly the center of that idea. You're not going to know if the legislator likes trains unless you know the legislator. And we're really lucky in Maine because you see all your state representatives at the Hannaford. They're completely accessible. They all have their home phone numbers or cell phone numbers. Just talk to them, meet them for coffee. Say, hey, I'd like to really tell you about the great stuff we're doing here at our museum, and make the connection. Because once you make the connection, you're going to have a much better chance of getting them in a position when they're in the State House and they're in a committee room and they're making a decision about something. In the back of their head, they're going to remember, oh, there's this other thing. And if you've been to a committee meeting, our citizen legislature is full of folks who tell stories about things they heard at the Hannaford or things they heard while they were getting their car repaired or whatever. They always tell stories like that. Those stories really matter. That's their connection with folks. So I'd really, really encourage you to do that. However, there are some other things happening in the state. And I'm going to put in the chat an example of one of the great things that are going on, and that is a new organization called Cultural Alliance of Maine. My friend Sarah is here today, and from Maine Historic Preservation and or Portland Preservation, and we have both been involved in this process with the Cultural Alliance of Maine. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about what this project is. And Sarah, I see you could chime in if you'd like. But our mission is that we're the first coordinated statewide industry alliance advancing the visibility and capacity of Maine's diverse cultural sector via collective learning, research, promotion, and advocacy. And this is an organization that you can get involved with right at the ground floor, right at the beginning, because that's where we are. We started out talking early on in the pandemic, amazingly 2 years ago this week. And really the idea was this question of how come our cultural life of Maine isn't at the table as we talk about the challenges of the pandemic. Certainly for many of our organizations, we were the first ones to close, and we are the last ones to open, because we almost all rely on gathering of people. And so it's really important that we start to think about it. One example that I have been giving for folks is the lobster industry. Now, there probably isn't a group of folks in Maine who argue visibly more often than the lobster fishermen. And you read about it in the paper a lot, how they fight about territory or traps or whatever it is. But you know, every spring in the State House, the Maine Lobstermen's Association is there speaking with one voice to all of the legislators. We don't have that in our cultural life in Maine. And the Cultural Alliance of Maine is making an effort to make sure that we start to have that. And I will tell you that the Maine Lobstermen's Association isn't an age-old organization. They were started, I think, in 2010. So they've only been around for a while. But all of us need to start, and all of us need to start together. So what does that require? And I think that, as Meg said, you can spend up to 10% of your time advocating with legislators. I think she's talking about lobbying. Isn't that true, Meg? So I'm actually a lobbyist with the state. As in my position, that's my requirement, to sign up to be a lobbyist. I don't lobby 10% of my time in any way, shape, or form. And if I was able to lobby 10% of my time, that would be a miracle. That would be amazing. So you don't, I suspect, have to worry about getting to the 10% of your time threshold. I think you should start with 1% of your time or 2% of your time. Make it a dream to get to 5% of your time. But any percent of your time will make a difference. And that's really, really important. And so I would encourage you to just start where you are. And there's a few ways to do that. First of all, who are the decision makers in your community? You probably know them. Meet them. Talk with them about what you're doing. And then move on to your local legislators. Meet them, talk with them, let them know what you're doing. That's really the core of it. We also happen to have a very responsive representation nationally. And you can call, it doesn't make any difference what your politics are or where you think things are important. You can absolutely call the offices of Senators Collins and King. You can call your member of the legislature, of the House of Representatives, and you'll actually talk to a person. They'll answer the phone. They all are well-staffed, and they're all really friendly folks. Invite them to stop by. Invite them to come and learn more about you. That's actually their job. And so that's the most basic level of advocacy we can do. We sometimes think of advocacy as this giant thing, insurmountable tree. You know, if you think of it as a huge pine tree at the other side of a field, and you look at it and you think, I've got to get up to the top of that pine tree, it seems impossible. I don't have a ladder that big. But if you go stand at the trunk of that big pine tree and you look straight up, you'll see that that pine tree is just a matter of little steps, the branches of little steps that will take you up to the top, or at very least higher than you probably want to be. And so you take the little steps. And of course, you too can be a member of your local select board, or you too can run for office. And that's certainly another opportunity for advocacy. So I'd really think about that. And then finally, there's the question, and feel free to ask questions, but they're in the chat. But I think it can be challenging to figure out what to say. And that's what we found, certainly with our request to organizations to get in touch with their elected county officials. How do you find them? Who are they? How do you communicate with them? And then the big one, what do I say? And those are all really challenging issues if you let them be, but they don't have to be. You love your organization. You're passionate about your organization. You believe in your organization. You probably donate a bunch of your time to your organization. So it's something you care about. Just tell them about that. Tell them about one artifact that's in your museum. Tell them about one exchange you've had or one student you're working with. Tell them a story. Stories really count. And they're so easy. You don't have to remember anything because you know it and it's the truth. And you just stay in your spot and you meet them where you are. And they'll understand. They hear, believe me, they hear from all kinds of people. They receive dozens of form letters where people have cut and paste the text of a letter and then sent it to them along with 50 of other people who sent them the same letter. That doesn't really affect the change that you want. Telling them your story, telling them your experience with your organization really, really does make a difference. And then I think at some point, Meg talked about this idea of not asking them to vote one way or the other or whatever, that you didn't want to make it about a person. And that's a really critical point. And there is a book that I think is like, it's probably 40 years old now, but it is, I think there was a reprint and update of it in maybe 10 years ago, but it's a book called Getting to Yes by Roger Fisher and William Ury. And Getting to Yes centers on a very simple concept of principled negotiation, is that you're talking about the thing, not the people, not the personalities. Obviously, we could all use a little better understanding of getting to yes as we sit in a divided country where we think that maybe the way to get somewhere is to stand toe to toe and scream at each other, but it doesn't it doesn't really work. So I think that the idea of having a principled negotiation, really talking about what you believe in, is the most effective way to advocate. And wherever you start, that's where you go, and you build from there. I think that it, there's on this bulletin board behind me, I have a little note that's always a reminder to me. I think about it a lot, and it says that the obstacles aren't in the path. The obstacles are the path. And so we have to understand that that's part of what we do. And that's part of the work we do. You in a museum would never go to your board and say, you know what, I just don't really feel like fundraising anymore. I don't think we should do it. It's not fun. Let's just forget fundraising. We'd never do that. We'd never think to do that. Well, in my view, advocacy is exactly the same as fundraising. We just haven't put it at that level. The more we advocate, the easier the fundraising becomes, because the pot gets bigger. And ultimately, that's what we need to do. We need to make a pot bigger. So get involved with the Cultural Alliance of Maine if you can. Reach out to the creative agency heads, the Cultural Affairs Commission, and that includes my friend Kate, the state archivist who's here today, and also Bernard Fishman from the Maine State Library, and Jamie Ritter, the Maine State Museum, Jamie Ritter from the Maine State Library, and Kirk Money from Maine Preservation, as well as Maine Historical Society and the Maine Humanities Council, and of course the Arts Commission. And all of us are working together to also address these issues. And so I'd encourage you to reach out, ask questions, talk amongst yourselves, and make sure you know ultimately that you're all in it together. We're all in it together. There's absolutely no reason to suffer in silence. Reach out, talk with each other. And I just wanted to say one final note. Let me put it in the chat here, a link. We have a pretty amazing opportunity here in New England this coming up in May, and that is that the American Alliance of Museums is going to be, or American Alliance of Museums is going to be having their annual meeting in Boston. I've had the pleasure of being involved with AAM for quite a number of years. I've done a term on the National Planning Committee meeting for the conference. It's a remarkable and inspirational event. It costs a little bit, but because it's in Boston, it might be an opportunity to go a little closer, and you just have to drive and not fly. But I'd really encourage it, along with going to the NEMA conference, along with going to the MAM conference. Start working on finding your colleagues. Start working on making connections, because it just makes all the work a lot easier. So thank you for inviting me, and I'm happy to take any questions or have you ask questions of the others.
Thanks, David. How about we let people have a chance to think about their questions? They can drop them in the chat. And I wanted to go ahead and bounce over to Kate McBrien to see if you've got any fun updates from the State Archivist's Office. And I do just have to say, I'm really impressed by how well all of the different elements of, the Maine cultural world work together. Not all states are quite so good at cooperation as you guys are. So good job.
Thanks, Meg. And I apologize to everyone for being late. I was actually talking about advocacy. I was appearing before the State and Local Government Committee in the legislature because they were talking about budgets. We've asked for 2 positions, and the #1 rule of advocacy is you show up. And so I had to be there and show up just in case. But yeah, so with the state archives, we've been very busy trying to get our collections, just like all of you, more processed, more digitized, more out there and available and accessible, to the public. Our biggest news, though, I think that will really impact all of you and give you something to look forward to, is that we have our Maine Historical Records Advisory Board up and running again. I'm really thrilled to see Howard Lowell here. He sits on that board and is helping to spearhead us through the process of getting up and running again. But many of you will know that that is a group that has given out grants in the past for archival projects. What the group is trying to figure out right now, we need to apply for funding from the federal government. And we're trying to figure out the best path forward. Is it small grants to local historical organizations like yours? Is it a roving archivist who could go around and help everyone with their projects? Massachusetts and Vermont have projects like that. So we're kind of in the figuring it out phase and trying to balance what we can realistically handle and what would be most beneficial for Maine's collecting institutions when it comes to archival collections. So I would definitely stress, if any of you have suggestions or preferences or specific needs, reach out, give me a call, let me know so I can bring that to the board. So we can factor it all in as we try to figure out the best step moving forward. My other big thing that I'm not sure if David touched on this at all, but another big thing that's happening at the state level right now is the cultural building for the state. David was smart and he didn't really go down this path, but I'll give you a really quick update. It's the building right next to the State House that houses the state archives, the state museum, the state library. It's been closed since June of 2020. We are still closed for renovations because the HVAC system completely died. We're getting a whole new HVAC system and full asbestos abatement, which is more comprehensive than any of us really wanted to know because it's throughout the building. But right now that project is still undergoing. It's still in process. I believe we are really close to getting some federal funding to help with it as well. So it'll enable us to do a little bit more with the project while we're all moved out. And right now the schedule is to reopen that building. They're saying fall of 2023. We all know how state construction projects go, so we'll see. But they're saying fall of 2023 right now. But in the meantime, all the organizations have moved out and they're operating as much as possible from remote locations. So the archives is still open. We've moved all the material. If you need to do any research, find anything, we're still here. We're just doing it by appointment. State Library has a new temporary location where they're open to the public. The State Museum is not open to the public, but they're still providing education programs online and trying to do as much virtually as they can. So we're all operating. We're just in different places to do it. Statewide issues right now, I think everyone is still really just looking at federal funds that are available, trying to keep organizations up and running and open. And then of course, the big question is just how open can all the public be for, the pandemic, and kind of watching how that goes. But I'm really hopeful. I think Maine had a great year last year when it came to tourism. It was huge. We broke records. So I'm hopeful we can do that again because we can do so much outside. So I think we'll have a lot of people coming through the state this year. Those are my updates from the state archives.
Thank you so much, Kate. And thank you again, David, as well. So David, did you have anything to add to Kate's mention about kind of what's happening statewide that are issues that folks should be tracking or advocating for?
Well, I do think that the issue with the cultural building is pretty devastating. We are a state right now that didn't take care of this critical property, didn't invest in this critical property, and now it's closed. And I think this optimistic idea of maybe the fall of 23 is pretty optimistic because there's a tremendous amount to do, and they're still in some ways assessing just what's needed. So it's a real challenge, but I think it's indicative of the fact that we haven't talked enough about ourselves. And Peter put in here about advocating collectively for a statewide issue versus advocating individually on behalf of your organization. And they're both really important, but I think that the statewide issue is we're all challenged, particularly, I think, museums, which all have facilities. And if there was an interesting project, it would be to compile all of the just simple basic work that was needed on the infrastructure of our history museums and arts museums and arts facilities, and put that number together. We probably wouldn't like what we see, but it would be a very effective, compelling amount of money. And that might be a national organization, and that, I mean, a statewide advocacy issue that hits both statewide and local institutions.
All right, did anybody else have any questions? Please feel free to either unmute yourself and go ahead and ask, or drop it in the chat. All right, Peter wants to know what's going on for the 250th anniversary.
I can speak to that a little bit,
Great.
Which is really nothing much, at least not on an organized level. I think there's discussions about it, but Maine is still trying to wrap up its state bicentennial, including a program, a dedication for the state's bicentennial time capsule, which will be tomorrow at the State Library. There'll be a press conference for that. And so I think because Maine had to drag on its bicentennial so long, we've been slow to look at the 250th as well. I know there's a national effort to get states involved, but I believe Maine hasn't actually organized anything yet.
I was also going to say that the national program, America 250, is ongoing, and it might be worth it to sign up for those emails and those announcements, because you know how this is going to go. It's going to go the same way that the bicentennial went, which was we got too far along and there wasn't a lot of planning, and then they turned to community and said, hey, what do you think we ought to do? So if based on what you're reading in other states, you have ideas, that would be really helpful. Looks like Dan's got some.
Meg, may I speak? One of the issues that NEMA is tracking is a long-term issue of the existential impact of climate change. And as a matter of fact, we're doing some work. Well, we're changing one of our value statements is actually now, going to be, as soon as we pass it, really focusing in on this. And also some of you know that we recently received an IMLS National Leadership Grant to do the first ever benchmarking of museums in climate change impact, energy usage and the like. So we're really devoted and committed to this. And one of the things that we're working on from an advocacy standpoint is trying to develop some pathways for sustainable and equitable funding streams for museums and cultural entities to receive resiliency funding, to do planning and to begin the process of assessing how climate change will be affecting their institutions over the long run. Because what I've noticed is some of the institutions that are already doing that kind of resiliency planning, they have to do the fundraising themselves and add it to their ongoing list, and it'll be at some point only the bigger institutions that have the muscle to do this that are going to get the funding. And I'd like to explore how can we make some funding streams accessible and equitable to all sizes and types of museums as they begin needing to do this resiliency planning. So I'm throwing it out there. I mean, I guess it's a question is, do you all in Maine have those discussions going? And if yes, what are, sort of the discussions? And if no, how can we best create some conversations on this level? The Cultural Alliance of Maine is a perfect venue for those kinds of discussions because they're long-term and they're going to be endemic and, part of our discussions, I think, for a long time. So anyway, it's both a question and then also just sort of an invitation to collaborate. So David, Kate, either one of you, I guess.
I agree. Collaboration is the key. Collaboration is the only way we're going to get through this and make it down.
The whole climate change issue is something that I've been hearing museums in Maine talk about more, but I think it's that collaboration, like getting everyone working together and on the same page for a louder voice, which Maine is really good at. Like you mentioned, Meg, where Maine institutions are awesome at working together and trying to support each other. And it's just having that central organization to help push it forward. But yeah, I see that as a topic that's on more minds. I'm seeing it in art exhibitions. I'm seeing it in, scholarly conferences. It's getting talked about more and more. And it's certainly well on Maine's radar that it's going to be hitting us. So, but we need to help push it forward in a more organized way.
So I guess then invitation is for all of us on the call today, anybody that's really interested in this issue of climate change, and especially on the funding components of it, just sort of brainstorming, how can we develop pathways? Feel free to, reach out to me or to Meg as sort of a point person, and we can begin that sort of triangulation of, talking with Dugan and Mam and, David and Kate, and the Arts Alliance, I think is a great, or the Cultural Alliance is a great place to sort of begin that, just to do a little exploring. But anybody on the call that's interested in this subject in particular, let's hear from you so that we can, sort of develop that conversation and that movement if that's appropriate. So thank you for that.
All right, so just to recap, where do you go from this morning's meeting? And the answer is go forth and talk about how awesome your organization is. And you can do that a bunch of different ways. You can call up or email any of your local officials. They don't have to be your state legislators. It can be, town council or whatever else is appropriate to you. You can send a message to Kate, who wants information about what the Archives and Resource Board should be doing with their money. So, tell her whether you want roving archivists or small budget grants or whatever else. Reach out on social media and let people know that you're participating in New England Museums Week so you can, post cool stories about some of your favorite objects and invite your members to talk about some of their favorite memories. You can reach directly out to the legislative offices by tagging them on Twitter and saying something. I did drop into the chat the links from AAM with their talking points. So if you want to talk to Senator Collins or shoot, I'm blanking. Who's the other Maine senator? I knew this 20 minutes ago.
Angus King.
Angus King.
Okay.
Thank you, Senator King. About universal charitable deduction or support for IMLS or anything like that, please go right ahead. Senator Collins is actually one of the writers of the support letter for the Office of Museum Services. So, you know, you can reach out and thank her for that. You can post pictures of when various public officials have been to your site. You can do some voter education for your members. There are a lot of different possibilities. We've got some sample language on our website. So I hope this has been helpful to you, and thank you all for participating. Like Kate said, advocacy is 90% about showing up. And I will pass it over to Kate, who looks like you've got one more thing you want to say.
I just wanted to share one last little tidbit. I was recently, a friend of mine and I were in touch with Senator King's office to recognize a dear friend of ours who'd volunteered with the Pejobscot Historical Society for about 30 years. He recently passed away, and Senator King's going to write a letter to recognize him for his memorial. But what his staff commented on was this was great because it reminded us how important volunteers are at all the historical societies and all the museums across Maine. And they're going to try to put out more of a social media effort to recognize that, thank volunteers, encourage people to volunteers. So it's on Senator King's radar. People are talking about this and they're aware. And so it's a great time for you to contact them as well. Let them know about all the amazing things that your staff, your volunteers are doing at your organizations to keep them going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I was participating in Federal Advocacy Day last week, one of the things I heard most from the legislative aides was that they really wanted stories from back home about like how the COVID relief packages had impacted them, whether it was getting a PPP loan or ARPA funding or anything else. They want stories that they can then turn around and take back to their various committees, et cetera. So. All right, any last words? Dugan, Greta, David, thank you all for putting your contact information in the chat if anyone wants to be able to follow up with any of our amazing guest speakers for today. All right.
Thanks for collaborating with us, Meg.
Always a pleasure.
And thank you, Dan.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
All right, have a great day. Go forth and advocate.